Minister, you met with David Livington today. Can you tell us what he was saying to you? What's the latest situation from London? Because that's where all the confusion is coming from.
Well, look, I mean, we're awaiting clarity from London, and that may or may not come in the form of a letter from the British Prime Minister. We'll have to wait and see. But what I can tell you is that from an EU perspective, I think Michel Barnier has been very clear today. There's a lot of concern amongst EU member states and partners about the prospect of a long extension of Article 50. An extension brings risks with it, obviously through a European election cycle, the establishment of a new commission, and the EU is dealing with a lot of things at the moment. And so the disruptive effect of Brexit for another 9 months or another whatever period of time is something that I think people will need convincing on. And what I mean by that is if there's going to be a request for a long extension of Article 50 by the UK, well, then there will need to be a very persuasive plan to go with that, to explain why that's needed and how they will use the time to conclude the outstanding issues that haven't been able to be agreed in London in the context of the Brexit process. It's also been very clear that there is absolutely no appetite to reopen the withdrawal agreement or the detail of that. As Michel Barnier continues to say, there is always an openness to changing the future relationship political declaration, because that's an aspirational document, if you like, in terms of the kind of future relationship that the UK may look for with the EU. But certainly, I think that EU leaders will await clarity from the British government in terms of what they're actually asking for. But I think that if there is an ask for a lengthy extension of Article 50, then it will need to be accompanied by a very persuasive and very detailed plan in terms of what the British government and the British Parliament propose to do to get majority support for something. Because the one thing that I think is very clear is that the EU do not want to grant an extension on request from the UK that brings us back to the same point that we're at today in 3 months, 6 months, 9 months' time, having wasted a lot more time. So, I think that message is very clear today, and it's up to the British government now to respond to that.
Paddy Smith.
The level of demand certainly being made by Michel Barnier was that we are going to have to see a change in the political process or specific events mentioned by the British in order to persuade the leaders. Are you on? I mean, we're talking about a major change in British policy and strategy.
Well, I think that's a matter for the British government to consider. But I think the message coming from Brussels today is that whatever plan accompanies a request for an extension of Article 50 needs to be persuasive. It needs to show how a majority can be found in Westminster to support something. And that hasn't been possible to date. We know that the British Parliament has voted against a lot of things, but hasn't voted for anything in the context of how the UK leaves the European Union in a way that's consistent with the withdrawal agreement that's been agreed. So, I don't think we should be prescriptive. That is a matter for the British government. But I do think it's important that the British government gets the message from EU countries that while, of course, there is an openness to an extension of Article 50, that EU leaders will be demanding in the context of a persuasive plan to accompany that extension, so that we can all move forward with some confidence that the outstanding issues relating to the Brexit process can be resolved.
Question for Sky here.
Thank you very much. Mr. Coveney, Mark Stone from Sky News. Two brief questions, if I may. First of all, to those people in the UK who think that ultimately an extension, short or long, is a given, you will, as 27, grant it. Are they foolish to think that? And my second question, there is a suggestion that Mrs May is going to ask for both a long and a short extension, either a short one that can then be extended if need be, or a long one with a break clause in it. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, look, I think the EU will be quite demanding in terms of looking for a lot more certainty I don't think there's any appetite amongst EU leaders to simply kick this can down the road, because it hasn't been possible to coalesce a majority in Westminster to support the current arrangements. And so if there's to be an extension granted for Article 50 on request, then there needs to be a persuasive plan in terms of how to use that time to overcome the obstacles to a managed, sensible Brexit. So,
could the persuasive plan involve it being short and then long, if things don't work out in a deal isn't achieved in a short period?
Well, I mean, that's a matter for the British Prime Minister. But I think, David Lidington was here today for a good reason. He met a number of ministers, including me. He also met Michel Barnier, and I think he will have a clear understanding of the kind of challenge that the British Prime Minister now has in terms of the ask she needs to make. Because don't forget, I mean, often in the UK, the focus on Brexit revolves around trying to find agreement within the British Parliament and the British parliamentary system. There are so many other countries that are impacted by Brexit too, and the disruptive effect of another 9 months of this process for the European Union as a whole is something that people are very concerned about. There is a willingness, I think, to agree with the British government to an extension, but I do think that EU leaders will be demanding to actually have a detailed plan of action that's credible, that can help us get over the blockage in Westminster right now, and I don't think that's an unreasonable request.
Guys, just an answer to my first question about whether you think that people are foolish to assume that ultimately you will grant an extension. This is all just politicking around.
No, well, look, I mean, nobody wants a no-deal Brexit. It's a lose for everybody. In particular the UK and Ireland, but also many other EU countries as well. But I think people would be very foolish to assume that this is just some kind of political game and that an extension will automatically be facilitated. I do think that EU leaders will be demanding, and understandably so, because this is disruptive for everybody. They will want to know, if there is an extension of Article 50, that time will be used to implement a new plan of action, potentially a new approach that can help a British Parliament to get beyond the impasse that is currently preventing agreement.
Okay, guys, we've got to go. One final question.
Are any member states actually willing to reject the request for an extension if they're not fully persuaded of the usefulness of it, as Mr. Barnier said? Are they willing to actually say no?
Well, I mean, as you know, the extension of Article 50 requires unanimous agreement from all member states. But I think you will have a collective approach, as you've had through Brexit for the last 3 years. I think before the summit begins, you will have a very clear collective message coming from all EU leaders through President Tusk and others. So I don't think you're likely to see any one or two countries getting isolated from the pack, if that's what you mean.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.